Good afternoon, everybody. Good to see you, and we're going to get started as we have another exciting session today with another guest speaker that I'll introduce to you in just a few moments. But I'll just remind you, we will be starting off with a few Poll Everywheres right after an announcement from one of your classmates. So Hannah, come on down and speak to us about the ASUW Bean Basket, please.
Hi, my name's Hannah, and I work at the ASUW Bean Basket. Many might not know about this store, but we're a student-run store on campus that sells non-perishable foods like dried fruits, grains, teas, and spices, and much more. It is located on the first floor, or undergrad floor of Undergrad Library in front of the By George Cafe. And we have two wholesalers that we buy in bulk from, and I feel like our store has products that are more affordable than like the DM, the District Market, or other stores. So I just wanted to plug that in just to promote our store. That is our hours. And my second note is that Bean Basket is looking for volunteers to commit to 3 hours a week. So if you're interested in leadership, food sustainability, and just helping out a student-run store, then apply to be a Bean Basket volunteer. We only have 4 workers, including me, so it would be a lot of help. And then you can also get a 15% off discount for all products. And the application closes October 30th. And so you can go onto the Instagram, and there's a link in the bio, or we'll also send out a Canvas message relatively soon. Thank you.
Applause for Hannah and for this awesome student resource and great opportunity. So please check it out, and as mentioned, we'll include it in the next message as well, but you can find this information on the slides. Okay, so on Poll Everywhere, we have a few that we're just going to run through pretty quickly. Don't worry if you missed the first one, if you're still hopping on. But let's see, last week, Emily Hovis spoke with us mostly about how to stop wasting food, but she also shared some important food insecurity statistics from across Washington. Where do we find the most food insecurity in general across our state? Is it in urban or in rural areas? So I'll give you like 10 more seconds to get your response in. Great. Thank you all so much. I encourage you to go back and look at Emily's slides and remind yourself, in fact, it was rural. Most of the class did get this right. And that is often contrary to what we think, right? We assume there's more food insecurity in city centers, when in reality, our food-producing regions, our rural economies, are often more food insecure. And we see that across our state, and we see that across our country. So an important kind of updating to any preconceived notions that some might have, either now or through Emily's talk. And don't worry about getting these answers right or wrong. This is more of a self-check so that you know you're walking away with some new knowledge. That's correct. All right, according to the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, what is the most significant source of food waste in the U.S.? Is it from our homes, our schools, our grocery stores, or our restaurants? So think not just about your experience, but in general, where do you think most food waste is coming from? So I will preface the answer by saying that I think that grocery store food wastage is severely understudied and underreported in this country. And the evidence that I have for that is that a couple of years ago, the Grocery Association in Canada partnered with policymakers to actually open up their records, and the numbers more than doubled, tripled, in fact. And so I think it's a massive amount of food waste that we don't yet fully understand. And in fact, most of you are correct that estimates of 40% of our food waste are coming from our own homes. And there's also food waste in other domains, but we ourselves as individuals, eaters, consumers, we have a lot that we can improve upon in our own homes and lifestyles. Okay, what is the best way to prevent food from being wasted? Most of you are on the right track. It is to buy less or to buy more thoughtfully, right? to go in with the plan when you're grocery shopping or when you're acquiring food, know how you're going to use it, instead of the kind of aspirational food purchasing and acquiring that many of us do. So awesome. The other areas are really important too, but that is certainly the highest order. Okay, and then for yourselves, this is going to stay open. We don't necessarily need to kind of see everybody's at this moment, but I wanted to invite you to just reflect on one action you can take to prevent food waste or wasting food in your own lives. And that could be your own personal action or a way that you could advocate for change at a more systemic level. So awesome. I already see lots of great ideas coming in. I love seeing freezing on there. That was a really important point, making the freezer your friend so that when produce or prepared foods are about to go off and they can be frozen, just freeze them for later, because you'll appreciate it when you come back to it that night when you don't have another plan for dinner. All right, awesome, folks. Appreciate your input here. And now I am very thrilled to introduce our next seminar and speaker. We have a really important session today focusing on fish within the food system and in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. And in order to walk us through this vast and quite complex topic is a PhD student from the UW Aquatic and Fishery Sciences. Lichi is born and raised in Singapore and has been kind of immersed in a fish-oriented world, I suppose, in personal and professional life in many different capacities. And it's really a great opportunity for all of us to hear from Lichi, who has great scientific expertise in this domain, and then has also taken the opportunity to sort of speak to us as eaters and as folks who are connected with the food system to think about what sustainability means for the ocean and for the people who use it, which is really all of us who use and rely on our healthy oceans as part of our healthy ecosystems. So with that, please join me in warmly welcoming Lichi. Thank you so much. Quick change. Should I mention that you foster dogs while you're setting this up? Sure. She has a lot of hobbies as well, beyond oceans and fish. And but this is, I'm very excited about your title slide. All right, over to you, Lichi. Excellent.
Can I just use, I guess I can turn this on.
Whatever.
All right, can people hear me? All right, sweet. All right, I'll just probably stand right here and not move very much, but give me a second to figure out presenter view. All right, hi everyone, it's good to be here. As Yona said, my name is Lichi, and I'm a PhD student here at the University of Washington. And today I'll be talking to you about how we can eat more fish in our lives. I'm sure you've seen this a lot. These are your United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and so Yona had invited me to talk about life below water, which is SDG number 14. And so the main goal of it is to conserve and sustainably use the world's oceans, seas, and marine resources. It's a pretty lofty goal. But before we really dive into it, I want to take you guys on a bit of a personal trip. So we're going to fly across the Pacific Ocean to Singapore, which apparently you can go round trip for $715, which is quite cheap these days. But I grew up on this sunny island of Singapore. So this is me. I am the middle child with 3 other siblings. I am, I guess, right here. And being on an island, I spent a lot of time at the beach. And I was trying to find photos of me with marine creatures, and then it turns out, I did spend a lot of time catching crabs. I have no pictures of me catching crabs. And this was about the closest to marine megafauna I got. This is a donation can in Australia. And then, I guess I should say I did actually get to touch a dolphin, but this is, back before marine mammal rights became more known as an issue. But anyway, this is my experience growing up on my island nation. And so when you think about Singapore, most people think about this big city and think about, the movie Crazy Rich Asians. And what a lot of Singaporeans will tell you is that we're not all crazy rich Asians. And one thing we are really proud of is our food. And so these are just a few pictures from my last 2 trips home. And as you can see, there is a lot of seafood in this picture. So there's crab, there's squid, there's jellyfish, etc. And, growing up, these seafoods just showed up on my plate. I never really thought about where they came from or, what they actually were. They were just, oh no, I have to eat fish again. And so thinking about things now, I actually, in preparing for this talk, I went back and looked at some statistics around seafood in Singapore. And it turns out that this is kind of a complicated statistic, but based on our food statistics of 2023, we can see that so these are all the meats that are consumed in Singapore in 2023. We can see seafood all the way down here. I guess I'll make a laser pointer. There we go. Okay, so we can see seafood down here. It's actually the second most consumed meat product or meat protein, I guess, in Singapore. And you might think, yeah, that makes sense. We're an island. It makes sense that we would have a lot of seafood. But it actually turns out that more than 90% of our food is imported into our country. And so part of Singapore's, I guess, food strategy is that we're trying to move towards more food sovereignty. And so we have our goal of 30 by 30, which is producing 30% of our food locally by 2030. And here's a graph, I guess, of local production as a percentage of total food consumption. This blue line right here is our seafood. We produce only about 8% of our seafood locally. And so how does this kind of link back to our SDG 14, which is life below water? So I guess maybe we can take a step back and break down what this goal actually is. And so I want to highlight the word sustainably used here, and maybe just give you some perspectives on what sustainability can mean. So sustainable development defined here is the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So this is a definition that was put forward in the Brundtland report, and I like this definition of sustainability. It kind of makes you think about where we're going and what we're doing with our lives, I guess. So just to outline some threats to the ocean, we've got marine pollution, we've got climate change, ocean acidification, overfishing, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, destructive fishing practices, and access rights for small-scale fishers to resources and markets. So these are directly taken from the targets and indicators for the Sustainable Development Goal 14. But I would argue that actually these all kind of link to a bunch of other sustainable development goals. For example, overfishing would be linked to, it's kind of hard to see, I think, that's a very big screen. So, overfishing would be linked, for example, to the zero hunger goal. Climate change and ocean acidification obviously would be affected by climate action, which is SDG 13. Illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing would impact, I guess, SDG 8, which is, I can't even read that. Decent work conditions, I think that goal is. And so, there's a lot of different ways that you could think about sustainable use of the oceans. But today, I'll be focusing mostly on this overfishing, I guess, aspect of it, and just and think about, get folks to maybe think about how this is defined and how this impacts the food that we get. So just some numbers. So seafood, over 200 million tons of food is produced each year from seafood. About 3.3 billion people get 20% of their annual protein intake from fish. There are about 58.5 million people working directly in fisheries and aquaculture, and of that, 38 million are directly employed in wild capture fishing. And so I know this is a nutrition course, so I threw in, this is just looking at protein intake over time by country status. So you've got your least developed countries here, your other developing countries, and your developed countries. And so you can see this is their protein intake by day, by person. So the fish is this green little sliver. And you can kind of see, you might have to squint to look at it really, really well, but something that I found really interesting was that, so there is a relationship between the wealth of a country and how much meat they consume. So it's generally, at the higher the GDP of a country, the more meat they consume. But this relationship is a little bit less strong when it comes to seafood. So you have some, and it makes sense if you think about it, there are some coastal communities that rely, I think, up to 70% of their protein can come from seafood. And so, I think that's just an interesting way to think about, I guess, availability of protein to different kinds of communities around the world. So going back to our sustainable development goals, I guess. So breaking down what seafood production is. So we've got, so this is a graph of seafood production over time. You can see we're at over 200 million tons here in 2021. So seafood production is generally broken down into aquaculture production, so food produced by farms, and capture fisheries. And so in about 2014, I think, was when the production of food from aquaculture overtook food produced by wild capture fisheries, which is, interesting to think about. But today, I'll be focusing mostly on capture fisheries. Singapore does a lot of aquaculture. I haven't learned enough about it to be able to talk about it, but so today we'll just talk a little bit about capture fisheries. So what are wild capture fisheries? So this is, I think, a really cool picture. So this is a picture from the Zhejiang province in China. It's the first opening day of fishing. So this is the picture of all the boats rushing out of the port. So China has a fishing moratorium over the summer. And so at the end of the summer, on the first day, we have all these boats that head out to go fishing. And it just gives you an idea of kind of the scale at which fisheries can happen. And so wild capture fisheries are basically, you can think about it as a bunch of boats that go out and catch fish and bring them back to port and for food or other things. But you can also think about it as, so this is a little bit closer to home. These are native fishers from, I think that's the Columbia River and the Klickitat River in Washington. And so they're going out to catch salmon for to sell and also for subsistence. And so all of these are different kinds of wild capture fisheries that there are out there. And so when we think about sustainably using these fish, so this graph and this concept usually comes up of maximum sustainable yield. It's a little bit complex to think about, but so here on the y-axis, you've got catch yield, and on the bottom, you've got fishing effort. And so the idea is that the more you fish, the more catch you can get, until a certain point where you're catching too many fish, and then the population starts to crash. It's a little bit complex, so I came up with a cartoon to explain it. So here we have a little fish swimming about in the ocean. We'll give your little fish some friends. And sometimes the fish friends get eaten by bigger fish. And that's normal. And so that leaves behind fewer fish, and these fish will reproduce and make baby fish, and then that's kind of how the cycle continues. So going back to our original population, the one that gets eaten, the sad fish, now we'll add in fishing. And so when we take out some of the fish, we're left with fewer fish, which will make fewer babies. But hopefully it'll be enough to continue our population anyway. But if we add more fishing, sometimes there might not be enough fish left to reproduce. And so that's basically how overfishing works, is that when we're catching too many fish, they are unable to replenish their populations, and that's what causes the population to crash. Oh, add question marks here, question marks here. And so, a lot of my work has focused mostly on how much fish can we catch without actually crashing those populations. And the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations puts together the status of world fisheries. I think they put it out every 2 years or so. And so this graphic from 2019 basically shows the number of fish populations. So the percentage of fish populations here on the y-axis over time, on the x-axis, and it shows the percentage of fish populations that are overfished, maximally sustainably fished, and then underfished down here. And so I think right now that number is about 34%. And so just to put it into context, on our maximum sustainable yield curve, everything that's maximally sustainably fished is defined as everything that's within 80% of this tip right here, which is, but it's important to note that this, statistic is based on your number of fish populations. So I think it's about 34% of fish populations right now are being estimated as being overfished. But when not all of this is converted to actual seafood. And so, I think right now the statistic is, I think it's like 22% or either 22 or 27% of our seafood actually is coming from these populations that are being overfished. And so this is basically, one definition of sustainability. So just thinking about it in terms of ecological sustainability, right? Like right now, what we're thinking of is just how many fish are out there. So that's just one definition of sustainability. And so I think there's no date here, but in the last year, I think this paper just came out in the last year that talks about 11 different actions needed to transition to sustainable marine fisheries. It's a very difficult graphic to read. I would recommend doing it in your own time. But it basically gives you an idea of the kinds of conversations that are happening now when we're talking about sustainable fisheries. And so today I'm going to use a case study just to highlight some of these the issues that we face in fisheries management. So we're going to go somewhere a little closer to home. This is Alaska pollock. You might also know it as filet-o fish or fish sticks or crab sticks. So I think hopefully some of you will have read the readings that were sent out. So or watch the video. So this is a fishery that happens in Alaska. So and also in Russia. So here's the Bering Sea. There's the Gulf of Alaska. Seattle's all the way down outside of this slide. But today we're going to focus mostly on the fishery in the Eastern Bering Sea because that's the one that I'm most familiar with. And so just to give you an idea of the scale of this fishery, it is a huge fishery. So I think the catch from last year came out to about 1.2 million tons, and it translates to approximately 1.85 billion fish in numbers. And so if you convert that, to fish sticks, so according to ChatGPT, I haven't actually verified this, but an average pollock will yield about 40 fish sticks. And so if you have 1.85 billion fish, that I don't even remember what the number of fish sticks is, but it will give you enough fish, it will give you about 227 fish sticks per person in the United States per year. Like, that's how much food comes from this fishery. Obviously, not all of it is converted to fish sticks, and this is a very rough estimate, but it's just to give you an idea of how huge this fishery is. It's also one of the biggest fisheries in the world. It's the biggest in the U.S. by volume, but it is one of the biggest wild catcher fisheries in the world. And so just to give you an overview of how this fishery is managed, so we have annual catch limits that are set based on assessment models. We have seasonal closures, we have spatial closures, and we have observer coverage, which are scientists that are trained to be on board these vessels that will sample your catch and for data. And we also have this thing called bycatch limits, and so that's what we'll dive a little bit into today. So what is bycatch? Bycatch, over here you'll see a leatherback turtle that's sadly wrapped around in fish gear. And so bycatch is basically the incidental capture of non-target species. So if you're going out to catch a bunch of tuna and you accidentally catch a dolphin, that would be bycatch, for example. But over here in Alaska, I guess in the pollock fishery, a lot of the bycatch ends up being salmon. And I will note that, bycatch makes up maybe about 1% of the whole fishery catch. So it's a very small number. It's considered a very low level of bycatch. But 1% of 1.3 million tons is still 13,000 tons. So that's still a lot of fish. And so we have these bycatch management measures in place, such as catch limits. So actually earlier just this last month, the Gulf of Alaska pollock fishery caught, they call it like a lightning strike. So they caught 2,000 Chinook salmon in just 2 hauls. So the boat, well, I guess I should have mentioned that the way that this fishery operates is it drags a net through the water, and it's technically a mid-water trawl, so it goes through it goes in the middle of the water column, and it sometimes might touch the bottom, but the gear is not meant to touch the bottom. And so, yeah. Anyway, so they ended up catching about 2,000 of these Chinook salmon in just two hauls, and that actually ended up shutting down the fishery because that was the limit. That was actually over the limit of salmon that they were allowed to catch for this year. And why is this such a big issue? So I actually really kind of struggled to put these slides together a little bit because of how much nuance is in this issue. So something that's been happening in Western Alaska is that salmon aren't really coming back to the rivers to spawn. And so there are these native Alaska communities and a bunch of other coastal communities that rely on salmon for their way of life. They rely on salmon for food, and for their culture. And so in recent years, the salmon just haven't been coming back, and so the fishery the subsistence fishery has actually shut down on the rivers, and so a lot of these communities haven't been able to access food that they've historically been able to. access for a long time. And so this has resulted in a bunch of conflict with the pollock fishery, because they're seeing the pollock pull up, tens of thousands of salmon, but these coastal communities are not actually getting their food, and so. Yeah, I put a couple of links here for in case you wanted to watch. There's a cool video about this where they actually talk about the meaning of salmon and why it's important to them. Did I click it? I don't know what happened. Okay, we're good. Thanks. But yeah, but the situation is pretty complicated. So a lot of the salmon that the pollock fishery catches, they do genetic tests on these salmon, and it turns out that a lot of the salmon that are caught in the pollock fishery are actually of Asian origin. So it's hatchery fish that were released from Asia into the Pacific Ocean, and they come over to Alaska to feed, presumably, and then to go back, and then end up going back. And so there have been a lot of arguments about whether or not shutting down the pollock fishery would actually have an impact on the Western Alaskan fish, so this is kind of part of so this is actually an ongoing discussion right now about how we can manage the pollock fishery, or how we can better manage the pollock fishery so that we can actually have salmon go back to these rivers, and so it's a very complex issue. And so the Pulitzer Center has actually put together a whole project that describes this in a bunch of different articles. I would recommend going through if you're interested and checking it out, because it's a really complex issue. But this is kind of where my work comes in, or I am about to embark on this work. So at the moment, I am by no means an expert, but part of my work will be looking at thinking about different bycatch strategies, and so how we can mitigate So currently we're trying to decide different management measures that we can impose on the pollock fishery in order to mitigate for these bycatch. And so some of these can include, changes to your gear. So if you put like a little, I think it's called a salmon excluder device in your net, it might allow salmon to swim out of the net. They might also they might put limits on chum salmon. So right now the limits are only on Chinook salmon, and so something that's being discussed is putting limits on chum salmon and things like that. And so I'm interested in thinking about how the pollock fishing behavior might change due to these management measures, and interested in kind of quantifying the trade-offs that come in with such management measures. And so bycatch is also not the only issue faced by the pollock fishery. They also have things like climate change. So this is an article that came out in 2019 talking about how warmer ocean, as the ocean warms, the pollock kind of scatter, and so the fishing fleets are having to travel a little bit further to go find their fish. And so it's a very complex. So fisheries management can be very complex, and I guess one of the things that I should highlight is that the pollock the Eastern Bering Sea pollock fishery is touted as one of the best and most sustainably managed fisheries in the world. And so hopefully just by highlighting some of these issues, you can think about, what that actually means. And so with that, I had some kind of food for thought. So if you were to think about the seafood on your plate, these are some questions you could maybe consider, like where did my seafood come from? Who gets to catch the fish? So if you have a catch limit, for example, who gets to use those limits? What kind of gear are they using? Are other species caught with it? And how much? So kind of going back to the food waste earlier, how much of that animal is actually used? So I think in the pollock fishery, they end up using almost all of the entire fish, but in a lot of others, you can, there's also a lot of waste associated with processing the seafood. And so just to highlight some other issues that I guess I won't have too much time to get into, that are faced by fisheries these days. So here's an issue that is pretty big. So there's forced labor. There have been a lot of investigations into forced labor from fisheries. So they have boats that go out and don't touch land for 2 years. That's, and they have, so I guess I would recommend going in and reading these articles because it's pretty bonkers. They take migrant workers from most of the time from Indonesia, and they take them out to sea where they can't actually escape, and they are put through some pretty horrendous conditions where they're not fed properly, and they get sick, and I think they have found that I think maybe like 30 Indonesians have died from poor working conditions on these fishing vessels. And so it's a very important topic, especially right now. And also, I guess it links to a bunch of these other different SDGs. Obviously, your decent working conditions. There's inequalities. There's thinking about responsible consumption, and what I think that one's like peace and justice, and strong institutions. So trying to figure out how to prevent this from happening, whether the seafood you're consuming is coming from a fishing vessel that uses forced labor. It's definitely something to consider. And something that makes this hard too is that seafood mislabeling is also a big issue. This article just came out today that about looking at how much seafood isn't actually what the label says. And then I don't know if people heard about this. This was front page of Reddit. Alaska snow crab season was canceled 2 years ago. It was actually not 1 billion. They found out that there were 10 billion crabs that basically went missing, which resulted in fishery closures. And those fishing closures had a huge impact on coastal communities such as this one, St. Paul in Alaska, where they depend on processing this crab for their community budget. And so with that, I guess I'll just end it right here, and leave you with some resources about thinking about what you're putting on your plate. So, and also, I guess I should add that a lot of these are individual actions, but probably the most impactful way of contributing to sustainable oceans would be at a policy level. So I would recommend the biggest action for you to take is to please vote in 2 weeks or whenever that is. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Lychee. You covered, first of all, I think just some really great definitions and context setting for terms and issues that we might be hearing about in the news but not have had opportunity to dig into. So I really appreciate that framing. And then I personally am fascinated to learn more about this case study that you described and that you're about to start working on because of the complexity and nuance. And I think it's such an important example of not rushing to a solution, not presupposing the solution, but actually taking time to understand the many different variables. So I have questions about that, but I want to see who has questions in the audience. We have time for discussion and for you to bring forward any ideas or comments that you want to share, as well as what you'd like to hear more about. Yes, I'm going to run up so I can give you the microphone.
If they, like, when they have the bycatch, if they throw the bycatch back, does that count as bycatch? Or at that point, would it just, like you catch the fish, it's the wrong fish, you throw it back, does that count? Or, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. So technically, it all counts, especially for, I guess, if you think about it in terms of, if you think about it in terms of, this, if you're one salmon caught in this giant net, you're probably not going to survive. And so for this particular case, I think they do throw back or they throw out some of the bycatch, but actually a lot of it ends up being donated. And so those donated fish go to the coastal communities that are impacted by food insecurity. But there's also nuance there because then some people in the communities would, I guess, push back against being given fish rather than actually being able to harvest it themselves. And so it's so the short answer is yes, they all count.
Thank you. I'm just running this mic over to the front here.
Thank you for such a great presentation. Earlier on, you showed a slide that showed overfishing increasing, and then before that, you showed a slide that had aquaculture increasing. So thinking about the causes of overfishing, is it more there are more boats out there? Is it more lack of population? You would almost think that overfishing would start to go down as aquaculture went up. It almost seems counterintuitive. So I was curious about that, if you could speak a little more to that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Also, I like your Hama Hama hat. But yeah, I think a part of it might be due to. Okay, wait. Let me think about this. So some overfished populations just haven't recovered. So that might be a part of it. Another part of it is that there are kind of cultural aspects of being a fisherman, for example. And so there are people who are fishers for generations and they continue to fish. There's also access. So, I think a lot of the aquaculture comes from China, for example, and also a lot of capture fisheries production comes from China as well. There is a growing appetite for seafood. There's also a growing population, so our demand for food has increased too. And so I think those all kind of contribute. And so, yeah, so it's also complicated. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question. Yes.
Thank you. If I understood correctly, genetics showed that some of the salmon that they're catching with the pollock are from Asian populations. that they are released into the wrong sea, let's say, so they can feed, and then they would return back to Asia rather than to the locals, right, the local rivers. Is that a way to prevent or monitor, or how can that be part of the solution?
Yeah, so that is complicated. So it's not just, so I think a lot of these fish, it's Asia and Russia, I guess I should preface, but it is complicated, because if you think about things in terms of maximizing food production generally, globally, then, you know, it would make sense to just have more fish. But, you know, if you think about things culturally, then these small communities are losing their way of life. But I don't know if there is a way to stop people from releasing fish. I think they're also, I don't know enough about this, but my guess would be they're also releasing hatchery fish. They're not releasing them in the Bering, they're just releasing them in the Pacific, and they swim over. Yeah, and so the reason they have hatchery fish is probably to boost their own salmon populations or their own food production. And so it's kind of hard to be like, our way of life is more important than your food source. So, you know, yeah, it is complicated. I don't know if there is infrastructure in place to stop that. Yeah.
The reason why these salmon swim that far is because their own food web is kind of out of whack as well. That's why they had to go that far to feed.
I'm not sure. They might naturally go out, like, I mean, yeah, so, you know, that's part of the challenge with salmon populations and salmon fishing. I'm not an expert, but, you know, I think naturally they would have gone there anyway. But yeah, these are, they're just much higher numbers now because of hatchery releases. Yeah.
Amazing. We have time for one more quick question. Yes.
You mentioned that you're from Singapore. I'm also from Singapore. And then you mentioned that most of the fish is like from outside, but it's like an island. So I was wondering, like, why is that? Like, is there not enough like fisheries?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess I can go back to the map of Singapore. Here it is. So if you can see, we are an island, but we're very close to places like, you know, to Malaysia up here in the north, and then Indonesia's down here, right? And so there's not a lot of ocean for us to fish from, even though we're an island. And also, fishing is a hard way of life for some people, and so I don't think it's a very desirable career option for a lot of Singaporeans. And yeah, surprisingly, most of our seafood, our locally produced seafood, comes from aquaculture. And so we farm a lot of fish, but we don't have any wild, or I think if we do, we don't even manage because it's so small. But yeah, I think it's just because it's, yeah, not very desirable.
Thank you so much to everybody for asking those great questions, and for Lichi for on the fly continuing to dig into the complexity with us and the nuance, and to understand that there are actually many different systems that comprise our fisheries, right? And then, of course, all of the human, economic, social constructions that we place upon those systems that impact their outcomes. So I hope this was a glimpse into the challenge and opportunity of fisheries. I look forward to further questions from you as you share your reflections and additional questions that we'll share also with the speaker. I want to remind everybody that we are actually meeting on Zoom next week. So if you come to the classroom, I will not be here, but you can set up your computer and Zoom from here. Really looking forward to that with all of you. And let's give one more round of applause for Lichi today. Thank you so, so much. That was really wonderful and informative, and I hope everybody has a great afternoon. Take care.